Yeah, hi, this is Howard Zinn, and I need to say something to the people who are gathering at the People's Summit and applaud you for what you're doing, because that's exactly what is needed today. Needed for people to gather and as a counter to the bigwigs of finance and industry who are trying to determine our fate, and in fact, whose determination is not going to be good for all of us. And so the idea of a People's Summit, one which can declare to the deciders of society, we don't like your policies, and here is what we think should happen. That is, a People's Summit should have an agenda, say, this is what we need, this is what working people need, this is what homeowners need, this is what consumers need, this is the kind of solidarity that we need to create across national lines. And we here at the summit are trying in microcosm to represent something that we hope will be a worldwide phenomenon and truly change the way people live in this world. Well, of course, it's true that the bigwigs, the financial institutions, and the Federal Reserve, in other words, both the financial corporations and the government are in charge of whatever's happening in the economy and in charge of this economic crisis. And so it's no different than it ever has been, except that when you have a financial crisis as you have now, when it then becomes more obvious that the people who are in charge are the people, in fact, who have brought you into the economic crisis. So we've seen this very specifically here in the last months of the Bush administration and the first months of the Obama administration. That is the period in which suddenly, there was alarm throughout the nation, especially alarm throughout the financial community. And in this period, we already have seen what happens, and that is what happens is that the people, yes, the people, as I say, who got us into this mess, the people who are in charge of the Federal Reserve, the great corporations, the great banks, the insurance companies, they are collaborating with the government to presumably solve this financial crisis. I say presumably because I'm very dubious that they will. And they may solve it for themselves in a certain way, but not for everybody else. And by solve it for themselves, I mean look at what has happened in these first months after the so-called crisis. And what has happened is that the big bailout took place. The government agreed almost immediately to give $600, $700 billion to the banks. And presumably then the banks would use this money for the benefit of consumers and homeowners, because a very significant part of the crisis has been that homeowners have not been able to hold on to their homes, huge numbers of foreclosures. And so all this money, hundreds of billions of dollars, given to the banks, presumably because they're going to make it easier for people to pay off their mortgages and make good on the debts that they owe to the banks. And I remember seeing on television, and Obama was not yet president, but Obama and McCain, the two candidates for president, standing with George Bush, and all looking rather satisfied that they were all agreeing that the $600 billion bailout for the financial institutions was a good thing. And after Obama became president, this continued. That is, more hundreds of billions of dollars, adding up to perhaps $1 trillion, again, given to the financial institutions. Now, this means, yes, they have taken charge of this situation, and when the bigwigs in both private industry and the government take charge of the situation. It means they're taking charge of it for their own benefit. What we obviously need is a different kind of reaction to this crisis. And you may notice that I put crisis sort of in quotation marks, the so-called crisis. And the reason I say this is because our economic system is always in crisis. Always in crisis. And it's only when something very acute happens to dramatize this crisis, to make it even worse, and when the crisis begins to hit not only the people that are always hit by the economic system, the small homeowners, the workers, when it begins to hit the banks and insurance companies, only then do they say, oh, we have a crisis. So that's a reason for talking about the so-called crisis. The so-called crisis is a situation where the normal functioning of the economic system, which works to the benefit of the rich and to the detriment of the poor, this normal working of the financial system has gone somewhat awry, and so it's become worse for homeowners and working people, and even had an adverse effect on the banks and corporations. Now, the corrections that have been attempted, that I just spoke about, the bailouts, that is something that has a history. Has a history going way back, to the very first Congress, going back to the American Revolution, going back to the establishment of the Constitution, when the very first acts of Congress were to bail out the bondholders who were holding bonds, money borrowed by the Continental Congress, by the government during the American Revolution. And one of the first acts of Congress was to bail out these bondholders to pay them the full amount for their bonds. But what this meant was that they then, in order to raise this money, had to tax the small farmers, which then led to rebellions by the small farmers, something that goes down in history very quickly and very briefly, and it passes through the pages of history in a second, something called the Whiskey Rebellion in Pennsylvania, which is a rebellion of small farmers against these taxes imposed on them in order to pay off the bondholders. Now, I cite that because that is a clue to how the taking charge of the economic system can be moved in a certain way and to a certain degree from the rich to the ordinary worker farmer. In other words, these farmers in Pennsylvania decided that they had to take things into their own hands. They didn't react to the tax laws by sending a delegation of Congress to lobby. They took things into their own hands. They took direct action. In other words, they took the action that workers, farmers, consumers have always taken throughout history when they recognized that simply appealing to the government, simply writing letters to their congressmen, simply lobbying in Washington, would be really crying out against a deaf leadership. And therefore they had to do something exciting, tumultuous, rebellious, violating the law, which is what they did in the Whiskey Rebellion in 1794 in Pennsylvania. As I say, this is a clue, I think, to what needs to be done in the midst of all of these efforts to, quote, solve the economic crisis by bailing out and subsidizing the rich. What we will need is the kind of direct action that was taken by the farmers in Pennsylvania, taken by the farmers some years before, just before the Constitution was adopted, in Western Massachusetts in 1786, Shays' Rebellion, not only in Western Massachusetts, but in other states at that time. Just before the framing of the Constitution in 1787, there were these rebellions of farmers, thousands of them, in Western Massachusetts, who gathered in front of courthouses and would not allow the courts to give away, to auction away their land, their farms, their livestock. So we have these instances of rebellion, Shays' Rebellion, the Whiskey Rebellion, and later on, in the 1930s, the reason we began to get some reform legislation from the New Deal administration when Roosevelt came into office is not simply because Roosevelt had decided on his own that the thing to do was immediately give help to homeowners. No, Roosevelt came into office without such plans. And what happened is he came into office and he found that people were taking direct action. He found that tenants were forming organizations, that they were in the cities where tenants were being evicted from their homes, that these tenants, very often organized, spurred on by left-wing organizations, these tenants were not waiting for the government to act, not lobbying for the government to act. These tenants were simply taking all the furniture that had been put out on the street, putting it back into the apartments that had been these tenements where people had been evicted, then changing the locks to make it more difficult for the landlord. So we have a historical precedent for direct action to deal with economic problems instead of the trickle-down theory, because that's what the subsidies to the banks, insurance companies, the bailouts, that's what that amounts to. It amounts to the trickle-down theory, the supposition that, or the claim that, whether they believe it or not, they make this claim so that people will think that they're doing the right thing. The claim that if they pour huge sums of money into the upper levels of the system, that will then trickle down to help homeowners and working people. So they give the money to employers, hoping these employers will create jobs, give money to banks, hoping that these banks will help people pay off their mortgages. Exactly the wrong thing to do. So what we will need in this present period, especially since it is now evident that Obama and his administration are not going to play the game any different than previous administrations, not much different than the Bush administration. It's evident that people are going to have to take policy into their own hands, utilize direct action in order to help workers get their jobs, homeowners keep their homes. And I think what this will require is, well, just as an example, something that corresponds to the bonus army of 1932. People coming from all over the country to Washington and saying to Congress, you must do this or we're not leaving. And so, yeah, you need to have people converging on Washington, 1 million people converging on Washington. You need to meet people demonstrating, and you need to have people dealing with the problem of foreclosures, not by waiting for the banks, but by preventing, by mass action, preventing these foreclosures from taking place. In the case of workers losing their jobs, taking over the factories, taking over the economic institutions that are moving to other countries or that are simply folding up. And yes, having the workers run the industries. Sure, these are bold moves, but it's exactly what we need. And it takes a crisis very often to lead people to take the bold moves that have always been necessary, because we've always been, as I pointed out, we've always been in economic crisis, but they never got bad enough to propel people into bold, drastic action. So it may be that if the unemployment situation gets worse and worse, if the foreclosure situation gets worse and worse, and they are going in that direction, that may be the impetus for people finally to take the economic system into their own hands. Yeah, well, as these bigwigs meet regularly, the G20, the G6, the G12, all the Gs, as they meet regularly to make a hash of the world, and we've already seen protests, right? In 1999, we saw the great protest in Seattle, which brought together a wonderful coalition of people, labor unions, environmental groups, consumer groups, brought them all together in a great protest against the World Trade Organization in Seattle. And the result was, you might remember, that the World Trade Organization was discombobulated by this, and they actually couldn't go on. So we've had two kinds of things going on. One is protests when these summit gatherings take place, protests which dramatize the limitations of what these people are doing, and which may even induce them to make some small changes in their policy, which actually happened as a result of the WTO protests in 1999. Some small changes in the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, not enough though. And the other thing, besides the protests against these G20 meetings and so on, the other thing that has happened is parallel gatherings of the other people in the society, not the bankers, not the G20 and G6 and G8 people, but huge gatherings in various parts of the world, world social forums, and which took place in Brazil, took place in Atlanta, Georgia, took place in a number of places, and where people, thousands, tens of thousands of people came from all over the world to express their solidarity in opposing what the great economic giants of society were doing. So it will take more of that. It will take more protests. It will take more parallel organizations. It will take more solidarity across national lines, more working people of different countries getting together. More, in other words, we need a globalization of protest to match the globalization of the great economic forces of the corporations. It's always interesting how the corporations create freedom for themselves to move across national boundaries. Suddenly, nationalism is an obstacle to globalization, but they want to retain nationalism as a way of hemming in everybody else and a way of keeping borders and preventing people from moving across borders, and they call them illegal immigrants. Now we should talk about illegal corporations that move across borders to take advantage of people, to exploit workers, to create situations which cause unemployment in one place and bad employment in another place. So yeah, we need an internationalization, a globalization of working class solidarity and action. I mean, this will take, of course, a lot of work, but I think it's very important not to be daunted by a vision of something that is going to take a lot of work. Every movement for change takes a lot of work. It takes time, it takes patience, but it requires that the vision be kept in sight. Because if the vision isn't kept in sight, however utopian that vision may seem, And well, once the end of slavery seemed utopian, and the end of the 12-hour day seemed utopian. But that utopian vision, and the one that I just tried to describe, a vision of economy being taken over by the people who really are responsible for the economy in the serious way, the workers and the farmers and the consumers, the vision of them becoming the deciders in economic policy. That vision has to be kept in mind even as we struggle through for months or for years against what is being done to us now.